Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Dim the lights, get yourself comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to spend the next few hours in what is genuinely one of the most hostile environments a human being can accidentally end up in. Siberia. Not the Instagram version with the cute snow and the rustic cabin aesthetic. The real one. The one where the air itself becomes your enemy and your spit freezes before it hits the ground. So settle in, relax, because we're going on a journey that's going to make your winter commute look like a pleasant afternoon stroll. The thing about Siberia is that most people who ended up there didn't exactly choose it. They were sent there, exiled there, trapped there by circumstance, bad luck, or in the case of Soviet prisoners, because the government decided that's where you belonged now. And once you're there, in the middle of a Siberian winter, the mathematics of survival become very simple and very brutal. Your body is burning calories just to stay alive. Your shelter is often terrible. Your food is scarce. And the temperature outside doesn't care about your will to live. We're going to talk about several people and periods where humans found themselves in this situation. Some of them survived. Some didn't. Most of them wished they had made different life choices before the point of no return. Let's start with Oymyakon. You've probably heard of Oymyakon before, maybe as a trivia fact at a dinner party. Did you know there's a place in Siberia where it gets to minus 90 Fahrenheit? Yeah, Oymyakon. It's a small settlement in the Sakha Republic in northeastern Siberia, and it holds the distinction of being one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. We're talking temperatures that regularly dip below minus 60 Celsius, which is about minus 76 Fahrenheit, and on really special occasions, the kind of occasions that make you question why you didn't just live literally anywhere else. It gets down to minus 71 Celsius, which is about minus 96 Fahrenheit. For those of you keeping score at home, that's colder than anywhere else humans live. Not as a temporary research station, as an actual town where people go about their daily lives. Oymyakon was never supposed to be a permanent settlement. Like a lot of things in Siberia, it existed because of a specific, somewhat absurd historical accident. Back in the 1920s, Soviet geologists and prospectors were poking around northeastern Siberia looking for gold and other minerals, because of course they were. The USSR was young and hungry and needed resources. A bunch of workers and their families ended up in this particular valley during the winter of 1924, planning to stay temporarily while they did their surveying and prospecting work. But then winter hit harder than anyone had anticipated. The people got stuck. They couldn't leave. And by the time spring came around and it became technically possible to leave, some of them had decided to stay. Maybe they'd struck something. Maybe they were tired of moving. Maybe they just accepted their fate with the kind of resignation that Russians seem to have in abundance. So Oymyakon became a thing, a permanent thing, a place where humans decided to live year-round at one of the coldest spots on the planet. Now, let's talk about what this actually means for the people living there. Because there's a vast difference between knowing that that something is cold and understanding what that cold actually does to a human body and a human life. When we talk about minus 71 degrees Celsius, we're talking about cold that's almost theoretical in its intensity. At that temperature, if you step outside without proper protection, you have maybe 15 to 20 minutes before frostbite begins. Your breath freezes in your lungs. If you try to run, you damage your respiratory system. Your skin doesn't just go numb, it starts dying. The moisture in your eyes can freeze. Your eyelashes can ice over. Exposed skin will develop frostbite within minutes. And all of this assumes you're moving, you're active, you're generating heat. If you're stuck, if you're immobile, if something goes wrong, that timeline gets much, much shorter. In Oymyakon, life in winter is not about thriving. It's about a series of small, careful decisions that keep you alive one more day. The school in Oymyakon has an interesting rule. Classes get canceled when the temperature drops below minus 52 Celsius. So minus 52, not minus 60, not minus 70. Minus 52 is the threshold where the local government basically says, okay, that's it. Even for kids who live minutes away from the school, we're not doing this. And you have to think about what that means. Those are the temperatures that are cold enough to be like, no, actually, we're going to shut down the entire education system. The temperature has to drop another 19 degrees beyond that before anything else really shuts down. And the funny thing is, people still go outside at those temperatures. Not because they want to, because they have to. You need to get to work. You need to get to the market for food. You need to get water. Although honestly, water is less of a problem because everything is frozen and you can just melt ice. The point is, life doesn't stop just because it's unbearably cold. Life happens anyway, just more slowly, more carefully, with more preparation. Let's talk about some of the practical details of winter life at minus 71 degrees, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. This is where you realize that survival at this temperature isn't just about being tough. It's about being smart. It's about understanding the specific ways that extreme cold breaks human systems and figuring out workarounds. First, clothing. You can't just throw on a winter coat and head out. You need multiple layers, and they need to be specific. The outermost layer needs to be wind resistant, because wind at minus 70 degrees is not something you want touching your skin. You need insulation underneath, but here's the thing. You can't wear cotton. Cotton holds moisture. If you sweat, and you will sweat because you're working hard to move around in all this gear, that sweat gets trapped in the cotton, and it freezes. So instead, people wear materials that wick moisture away. Merino wool, if they can get it. Synthetic materials. Anything that doesn't trap moisture. You wear layers that you can take off if you start sweating, because getting wet in Siberia in winter is potentially fatal. Your face is completely covered, not because you're trying to look cool or mysterious, but because exposed skin develops frostbite in minutes. So you have a balaclava, a heavy hood, maybe goggles. Your hands are in mittens, not gloves, because mittens keep your fingers together and generate more heat than individual finger compartments. Your feet are in specially insulated boots, and the boots are often stuffed with insulating materials. Some people use felt. Some people use newspaper. The goal is to create dead airspace, because air is actually an insulator, and dead airspace is the best insulator there is. When people step outside in Oymyakon during winter, they're not wearing casual winter gear. They're wearing the result of generations of trial and error about what keeps you alive when the temperature is at or below -70 degrees. It's specialized, it's specific, and it's necessary. Second, shelter. Your house in Oymyakon is not a cute little wooden cabin. It's a heavily insulated structure that's often built in specific ways to deal with the cold. The walls are thick, sometimes extremely thick. You might have a vestibule, a sort of airlock between the outside and the inside, so that when you open the door, you're not letting all your heat out at once. Inside, you need heat. Constant heat. Not because you want to be comfortable, but because if your house gets too cold, pipes burst, walls start contracting and cracking, and the whole structure becomes compromised. So you have a heating system. Historically, this was a wood stove or coal stove. In modern Oymyakon, some people have access to electricity and can use electric heaters, but many still rely on wood or coal burning systems. These stoves run constantly during winter, and I mean constantly. You're feeding them fuel day and night, because the moment you stop, the cold starts winning. The inside of your house might be maintained at around 20 Celsius, maybe 22 if you're being luxurious. That's about 68 to 72 Fahrenheit. The outside is -70. The temperature differential is enormous. This differential creates its own problems. Condensation forms inside the house. Moisture freezes on windows, on walls, on ceilings. You get frost buildup inside your home. It's strange to think about being inside and still having frost everywhere, but that's what happens. Third, food. This is maybe the most unsettling part of Siberian winter survival, because food in Oymyakon is not about pleasure or variety. It's about calories and nutrition, and it's about preservation. Fresh food in winter is essentially impossible to get locally. Everything has to be preserved, either through freezing, which is easy, because it's -70 outside, drying, salting, or smoking. People eat a lot of preserved fish, a lot of reindeer meat, a lot of dairy products that have been processed and preserved. Bread gets hard and requires careful storage. Fresh vegetables are basically not a thing during winter. But here's the thing. In the extreme cold, your body burns calories just to maintain temperature. You need to eat more. People in Siberia historically eat more fat and protein than people in temperate climates, because fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, and protein is essential for maintaining muscle mass while you're working hard to survive. So you're eating a lot of meat, a lot of fat, a lot of preserved foods that would be considered heavy or unhealthy in a normal climate. In Siberia, they keep you alive. There's also the psychological aspect. Food is comforting. When you're living in -70-degree cold for months on end, the warmth of a hot meal, actual hot food, brought to temperature in your house, is one of the few pleasant experiences you have. So people place enormous value on making those meals taste good, on preserving enough variety that you don't lose your mind eating the same thing every single day. Fourth, darkness. This is something that people don't always think about when they think about Siberian winters, but it's crucial. In Oymyakon, during the winter months, the sun barely rises above the horizon. There are periods where it doesn't rise at all. We're talking about nearly complete darkness for weeks on end. Not twilight, not dim light, darkness. This darkness does things to human psychology. It messes with your circadian rhythm. It makes vitamin D deficiency almost inevitable because you're not getting sunlight. It makes depression more likely. It makes it psychologically harder to motivate yourself to go outside, to be active, to maintain the routines that keep you physically and mentally healthy. So people deal with it. They use whatever light sources they have available. Historically, this was candles and oil lamps. In modern times, it's electric lights, if you have access to electricity. Some people invest in special light therapy boxes designed to mimic sunlight, trying to trick their brains into not becoming completely depressed. But the reality is, you're living in darkness for months. It's just something you accept, something you endure. And that, in a nutshell, is daily life in Oymyakon at minus 71 degrees. It's manageable if you're prepared, if you have resources, if you've adapted over time. But it's never comfortable. It's never easy. It's a constant negotiation with an environment that doesn't care about your comfort or your survival. The environment just is, and you either figure out how to exist within it or you don't. The Gulag years when you didn't have a choice. But here's the thing about Siberia. For a lot of people, especially in the 20th century, it wasn't a choice. It wasn't something they moved to voluntarily. They were sent there. And the story of survival in Siberian cold becomes much darker and much more complicated when you're not living there by choice. Let's talk about the gulags, the Soviet labor camps. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, the Soviet Union operated an extensive system of forced labor camps scattered across Siberia and other remote regions. Millions of people went through these camps. Millions. Political prisoners, supposed enemies of the state, people who had committed minor crimes, people who had said the wrong thing at the wrong time, people who were in the wrong place when a purge happened. They all ended up in the gulags, and a significant portion of those camps were in Siberia, in the cold, in regions where winters were brutal and survival was uncertain. Now, the conditions in the gulags were terrible. Let's be clear about that. Starvation, disease, violence, and exposure were all constant threats. But what interests us right now is specifically what happened to prisoners during winter. Because the gulags didn't pause for cold, work continued. Prisoners were still expected to fulfill their quotas, whether they were cutting timber in minus 40-degree weather or mining in conditions that would kill a person in hours. Let's talk about one of the most famous accounts of Gulag survival, because it illuminates exactly how brutal this was. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Soviet dissident and novelist who spent time in the gulags in the 1940s and 1950s. He wrote about his experiences in a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which is part memoir, part history, part philosophical meditation on suffering and survival. Solzhenitsyn didn't write specifically about Siberia. He was in camps in various locations, but his observations about winter in the camps are relevant to our story. He describes, in detail, what happened to human bodies in extreme cold when those bodies were already malnourished, already weak from disease and overwork. The cold doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care that you're a political prisoner or that you're already dying from tuberculosis. The cold just does what cold does. It saps warmth. It makes pain worse. It turns minor injuries into life-threatening problems. Solzhenitsyn describes winters where prisoners would get frostbite and simply accept it as an inevitability. You'd lose your fingers or your toes, and you'd try to keep working, because if you couldn't work, you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat, you died faster than you'd die from frostbite. So you made calculations. How much frostbite can I endure and still move enough to not starve completely? It's a horrifying calculation, but it's the one prisoners faced. The camps had minimal medical care. Frostbite would get infected because there were no antibiotics available, or because the infection was accepted as a death sentence anyway. Gangrene would set in. Limbs would have to be amputated by other prisoners or by camp doctors who had minimal training and no anesthesia. And then the amputated prisoner would either die or somehow continue working with missing fingers and toes in minus 40-degree weather. But let's back up and talk about why these camps existed in the first place, and why so many of them were placed in Siberia specifically. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, needed labor. It needed to build infrastructure, extract resources, create an economy. But it also needed to eliminate political opposition and punish anyone who didn't fit into the Soviet vision. So it created the Gulag system. Millions of prisoners, forced to work, paid nothing, fed barely enough to keep them alive. It was slavery, really. It was industrial slavery. Why Siberia? Because Siberia was remote, resource-rich, and sparsely populated. The Soviet Union wanted to develop Siberia, to extract its resources, to build infrastructure there. But they didn't want to send regular workers there, because nobody wanted to go to Siberia voluntarily. So they sent prisoners. Prisoners didn't have a choice. Prisoners would work for free. Prisoners would do the dangerous jobs that might kill you. Prisoners were expendable. The Soviet logic, if you can call it that, was simple. If a prisoner died, you replaced them with another prisoner. There was never a shortage. The political purges and the gulags fed each other. Create enemies of the state, arrest them, send them to work camps. The camps became more brutal because there were more prisoners than work to be done. The camps became more overcrowded. More people died. More people were arrested to replace them. And all of this happened in some of the coldest places on Earth. Let's talk about a specific camp, or rather, a specific camp system, because many camps operated during the winter months in genuinely lethal conditions. The Kolyma camps. This is a region in northeastern Siberia, even further north and east than Oymyakon. extensive gold mining operations run by the Soviet Union using forced labor. Kolyma is famous in the Gulag literature for being one of the worst places, one of the camps where survival rates were lowest and conditions were most brutal. In Kolyma, during winter, temperatures regularly dropped below -50 Celsius, sometimes much lower. Prisoners were sent to work in gold mines and in above-ground mining operations. They were clothed inadequately. They were fed inadequately. They were worked to exhaustion. And then they had to survive the night in barracks that were heated minimally or not at all. One survivor of the Kolyma camps, a man named Varlam Shalamov, wrote a series of stories called Kolyma Tales that describe life in these camps. Shalamov was a writer, imprisoned for supposed political crimes, and he spent years in Kolyma. His accounts are among the most detailed and harrowing descriptions of Gulag life that exist. Shalamov describes in one story a winter where prisoners were assigned to work outside in temperatures that were so cold that the numbers almost seem fake. -60, -65. Conditions where exposed skin develops frostbite in minutes and fingers become useless for gripping tools. And yet prisoners were still expected to work. He describes watching other prisoners slowly die from cold. Not dramatically, not quickly, just gradually losing the ability to move, to think, to function. Hypothermia creeping in. The prisoner becoming slower, more confused, eventually just lying down in the snow and not getting up. And nobody could help them because everyone was focused on survival. Because the camp guards didn't care. Because that's how it worked. Shalamov also describes something interesting: the relationships between prisoners. In extreme conditions, you'd think solidarity would emerge. And sometimes it did. But more often, people became isolated. The cold and hunger and exhaustion made people selfish. You focused on your own survival. You didn't share your rations. You didn't help someone who was weaker unless it directly benefited you. In some ways, that's a rational response to a system designed to make survival contingent on your willingness to let others die. But it also means that people in the Gulag experienced both the physical horror of the cold and the psychological horror of being surrounded by other humans who couldn't or wouldn't help you. The death rate in the Kolyma camps during winter was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that in some years, the mortality rate exceeded 30%. 30%. That means if you were in Kolyma, there was a 1 in 3 chance you'd die that year. And if you survived the year after might be just as deadly. What made Kolyma specifically deadly? Several factors. The location was one. It was isolated and remote. The cold was extreme. The infrastructure was minimal. The guards were often as hardened and cold as the environment itself. And the work being done gold mining was incredibly labor-intensive and dangerous, even in good conditions. In Siberian winter, with malnourished, weakened prisoners, it became genuinely lethal. There were also diseases that thrived in the camp conditions. Typhus was endemic. Dysentery was common. Pneumonia and other respiratory infections spread rapidly through overcrowded, poorly ventilated barracks. So you had prisoners dying not just from cold and starvation, but from preventable diseases that killed them faster than the cold could. A typical day in a Kolyma camp during winter went something like this. You'd wake up in the barracks. It might be around 5 or 6 in the morning, depending on the season and what the guards had decided. The barracks would be cold. There might be some heat, but it was never enough. You'd get dressed in whatever inadequate clothing you had. There might be a breakfast, a small amount of bread, maybe some thin soup. It was never enough calories for the work you'd be doing. Then you'd march out to the work site. This could be a gold mining operation, a logging site, or some other project. You'd work for hours in cold that was almost incomprehensible. Your breath would freeze. Your fingers would go numb. The work itself was difficult, moving earth, breaking rock, felling trees. Your body would be generating some heat from the work, but not enough. At some point, there'd be a brief break for lunch. Another small ration of bread. Some water, if you could get it. The water would taste awful, often contaminated or stale. You'd eat quickly, trying to absorb whatever calories you could, knowing it wasn't enough. Then you'd work again until evening, when the guards decided to call it. You'd march back to the barracks. You might get dinner, more bread, some thin soup or gruel. It was the same amount of calories every day, regardless of how much work you'd done or how many calories you'd burned. Then you'd try to sleep in a barracks that was too crowded, too cold, and filled with people who were sick or dying. Many prisoners slept in their clothes because it was warmer that way. Many developed infections from the constant moisture and lack of hygiene. Many simply died in their sleep. If you got sick, there was minimal medical care. If you got injured, there was minimal medical care. If you got frostbite, someone might amputate your fingers or toes with minimal anesthesia, or they might just leave it to get infected and kill you. The calculus was simple. Are you still useful as a worker? If yes, try to keep you alive long enough to continue working. If no, let nature take its course. And this happened night after night, day after day, for months. For years, if you survived that long. The thing about the gulags that's important to understand when we talk about survival in Siberian cold is that survival there wasn't really about individual will or skill. It was about luck. Luck that you didn't get seriously injured. Luck that you didn't catch a deadly disease. Luck that you got assigned to a work detail that was slightly less deadly than others. Luck that your guards that day were in a mood that meant they wouldn't work you to death before nightfall. Alexander Solzhenitsyn survived. Varlam Shalamov survived, though just barely. Millions of others didn't. They died in Kolyma, in Oymyakon, in camps whose names have been largely forgotten, in the cold, in the dark, in conditions that were deliberately made intolerable. When we talk about human survival in extreme Siberian cold, we have to remember that not all survival is chosen. Not all survival is the result of preparation and skill. Sometimes survival is just a matter of being lucky enough to make it through another day in a system designed to break you. The tragic arc of early explorers when you're just trying to get home now. Let's shift to a different kind of cold survival story. one where people weren't prisoners, weren't trying to mine for gold under threat of death. They were explorers, adventurers, people who ventured into Siberia voluntarily, usually with the goal of getting somewhere, mapping territory, finding resources, reaching a destination. And then the winter came, and the cold came, and they realized they'd made a terrible mistake. Let's start with a story that's less well known than some of the polar exploration disasters, but no less tragic. In the early 1800s, there was an explorer named George Telford who was part of a Russian expeditionary force trying to map northeastern Siberia. Actually, wait, let me be honest. I'm not entirely certain I have the name right. Siberian exploration records are fragmentary, poorly preserved, and often exist only in Russian archives that are difficult to access. But the story, in its broad outlines, is real. There were multiple expeditions, multiple tragedies, multiple stories of explorers who got trapped in Siberia during winter and didn't make it out. Let me tell you a more well-documented story instead. In the 1860s, there was an explorer named Julius Payer, an Austrian-Hungarian military officer who was involved in multiple Arctic and sub-Arctic expeditions. Payer wasn't specifically in Siberia. He was more focused on the Arctic. But his experiences with extreme cold and winter survival in the far north are relevant to our story. Payer participated in the Austro-Hungarian polar expedition of 1874-1876, which was designed to reach the highest northern latitudes possible and map whatever territory they could find. The expedition was relatively well-funded and well-supplied, at least compared to many other expeditions of the time. It had a ship, the Tegethoff, and a crew of experienced men. But here's the thing about Arctic exploration in the 1870s. You could be relatively well-supplied and still end up in an absolutely hellish situation if the ice trapped you, if the cold was worse than expected, or if anything else went wrong. The Tegethoff got stuck in pack ice north of Siberia. Stuck. Not temporarily. Permanently for a year. The ice didn't break. The ship became trapped in the ice floe, and the crew had to endure an entire Arctic winter with limited mobility and limited ability to find food or supplies. For months, the crew of the Tegethoff was frozen in place. They couldn't leave the ship. The ice around them was unstable. The temperature was brutal. They had enough food and fuel, which was fortunate, but they also had the psychological burden of being trapped. Not able to move, not able to make progress toward their goal, just waiting day after day for the ice to break or the cold to end. Payer described this period as profoundly difficult, not because of immediate danger, but because of the constancy of the cold and the sameness of the days. You wake up, it's cold, you do a few tasks, it's still cold. You try to keep the ship functioning. It's still cold. You eat a meal. It's cold. You sleep. And then you wake up the next day and do it all again. The monotony was almost as difficult as the cold itself. Eventually, the Tegethoff did break free of the ice. The crew did survive. They made it back to civilization. But the experience left an impact. Payer understood, at a deep level, what it meant to be at the mercy of an environment you couldn't control. let's talk about expeditions that were less fortunate. Explorers who didn't survive. Explorers who got trapped in Siberia and couldn't make it out. There was an explorer named Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld, a Swedish-Finnish explorer who attempted the first successful navigation of the Northeast Passage, the route from Europe to Asia via the Arctic Ocean, following the coast of Siberia. This was in the 1870s and 1880s. Nordenskjöld's expedition was relatively successful, but it still involved wintering in Siberia in extremely harsh conditions. Actually, I realize I'm being somewhat vague here, and I apologize. The problem is that there are so many stories of Siberian exploration disasters, so many expeditions where men got trapped in cold and didn't survive, that the historical record is almost overwhelming. There were Spanish explorers trying to traverse Siberia. There were Russian explorers. There were adventurers from various countries trying to prove something or reach somewhere, and they all faced the same brutal calculus. If you get caught in Siberian winter, unprepared, you will probably die. Let me tell you one story that is well documented, that has survivor accounts, and that illustrates exactly what happens when an expedition gets caught in the cold, unprepared. In 1913, there was a Russian Arctic expedition led by Captain Georgy Brusilov that set out to navigate the Northeast Passage. The expedition had a ship, the SV Anna, and a crew of about 20 men. The goal was scientific exploration mapping, studying animal populations, collecting data about the Arctic. But things went wrong almost immediately. The ship got stuck in pack ice. The crew had to endure the Arctic winter. They had some supplies, but not enough. They had fuel, but it ran low. They had food, but it was rationed strictly. And the cold was worse than they'd expected. After months of being stuck in the ice, the crew's situation became desperate. The ship was drifting, trapped in pack ice that moved unpredictably. They couldn't get free. They couldn't go anywhere, and the supplies were running out. At some point, a mutiny happened. Some of the crew wanted to attempt to leave the ship, to try to trek across the ice to land or to a potential rescue. The captain wanted to stay with the ship. There was a conflict, possibly violent. The mutineers left the ship. The captain, Brusilov, stayed with the ship. He eventually died, either from the cold, from starvation, or from despair. The exact cause isn't entirely clear from the historical record, but he didn't survive. Some of the crew who left the ship also didn't survive. They got lost on the ice. They weren't equipped for a trek across pack ice in Arctic winter. They died from the cold, from hunger, from exhaustion. A few crew members survived. They managed to either get rescued or make it to land. They made it back to civilization and told the story of what happened to the SV Anna. The Brusilov expedition is a useful lens for understanding something important about cold survival. It's not just about physical toughness or will. It's about information. It's about preparation. The Brusilov expedition was trapped because they didn't have enough information about ice movements in that region. They were unprepared for the length of time they'd be trapped. They didn't have enough supplies. And when the crisis came, the leadership made decisions that weren't optimal. But here's the thing. Even if the captain had made different decisions, even if the crew had been better prepared, they might still have died. Because Siberian cold, Arctic cold, is an environment that kills people. Sometimes preparation and good decision making keep you alive. Sometimes it doesn't matter. You're still going to die. Let me tell you another story. This one is from the early 20th century, and it's about a man named Roald Amundsen. Roald Amundsen was a Norwegian explorer who was famous for reaching the South Pole and for attempting various Arctic expeditions. In 1920, after an attempt to reach the North Pole that went wrong, Amundsen was planning his next expedition. He wanted to traverse the Northeast Passage again and then head toward the North Pole. His expedition in 1923 was relatively well equipped by the standards of the time, but it still involved wintering in the Arctic. And wintering in the Arctic in the early 1920s, even with good equipment, was a harrowing experience. Amundsen's account of his winter in the Arctic includes descriptions of the psychological impact of the constant cold and darkness. Even a tough, experienced explorer, and Amundsen was very tough and very experienced, could be broken down by months of extreme cold and darkness. The isolation was part of it. The inability to go outside, except briefly. The sensation of being trapped in a small space with the same people, in the cold, in the dark, month after month. Amundsen survived his Arctic wintering, but he understood something fundamental. Surviving in extreme cold isn't just about physical resilience. It's about psychological resilience. It's about being able to maintain your sanity, your hope, your will to live, in conditions that are designed by nature to break those things. The tragedies of polar and subarctic exploration, and there were many, many tragedies, often weren't just about people being unprepared or unskilled. Often they were about people doing everything right and still dying because the environment was simply too hostile, because the cold was too extreme, because something went wrong and there was no backup plan, because rescue was impossible. When we talk about human survival in Siberian and Arctic cold, we have to remember that not everyone made it. Not everyone could survive, no matter how tough they were or how hard they tried. The cold killed a lot of people, a lot of smart, tough, experienced people. And their deaths tell us something important. Extreme cold is a killer. And the farther north you go, the colder it gets, the more likely it is that you will not survive. The nomads making a life in the impossible, but here's the thing. While explorers were dying and prisoners were suffering, there were people living in Siberia, not because they were forced to, not because they were trying to get somewhere else, but because they had adapted to the cold over generations, because it was their home. I'm talking about the indigenous peoples of Siberia, the Yakuts, the Chukchi, the Evenki, the Sami, the Buryats, and many others. These peoples didn't move to Siberia in the 19th century or the 20th century. They've been there for thousands of years. They developed cultures, technologies, and ways of life that were specifically adapted to surviving in extreme cold. The Yakuts are particularly interesting in this context because they live in the Sakha Republic, which is where Oymyakon is located, and they've been living there for centuries, surviving winters of -60, -70, -80 degrees. How did they do it? Well, it wasn't magic. It was knowledge. Accumulated, tested, refined knowledge about how to live in extreme cold. First, let's talk about clothing. The Yakuts developed traditional clothing specifically designed for their climate. They used reindeer fur because reindeer fur is incredibly insulating. The fibers are hollow, which traps air and creates insulation. They used furs with the fur on the outside and the skin on the inside, which is the right way around for repelling moisture and wind. They layered clothing. They covered their entire bodies. They understood, without any modern scientific knowledge, exactly what clothing needed to be to keep you alive in -70 degrees. Second, let's talk about shelter. The Yakuts traditionally lived in yurts or in more permanent wooden structures that were heavily insulated. These structures were designed to be heated efficiently to maintain warmth with minimal fuel expenditure. They had small windows, if any, to minimize heat loss. They had entrance vestibules to create an airlock effect. They positioned the structures to minimize wind exposure. Again, this was accumulated knowledge about how to live in extreme cold. Third, let's talk about food. The Yakuts traditionally herded reindeer and horses. They hunted. They fished. They preserved food for winter. They understood that you needed fat and protein to survive in cold. They ate organs because organs are nutrient dense. They made dairy products. They understood, without modern nutritional science, exactly what they needed to eat to keep their bodies functioning in extreme cold. Fourth, let's talk about psychology. The Yakuts had cultural practices, stories, songs, rituals that helped people maintain mental health during the long winter darkness. They had community gatherings. They had celebrations. They had ways of making the unbearable cold something that was woven into their culture and their identity, rather than something foreign and hostile. The point is, the Yakuts and other Siberian indigenous peoples didn't just survive in extreme cold. They thrived. They built complex societies. They developed art and music and literature. They created beauty in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And this is important because it tells us something about human adaptation. We're incredibly adaptable creatures. Give us enough time, enough generations, and we can figure out how to live almost anywhere, even in -70-degree Siberian winter. Let's talk about the reindeer herders specifically, because their life is particularly interesting. The Yakuts and other peoples of Siberia have practiced reindeer herding for centuries. Reindeer are animals that are specifically adapted to cold. They have thick coats. They have special feet with hair between the pads that helps them grip ice. They eat lichens and moss that are available even in the harshest environments. And they're social animals that live in herds, which is useful for both the animals and the people herding them. A traditional reindeer herd might number in the hundreds. The herder and his family would live with the herd, moving with them as they migrated following food sources. In winter, the herds would move to areas where there was access to lichen and other forage. herders would live in traditional structures, hunting to supplement the diet provided by the herd, making use of every part of the reindeer for food and for materials. Living as a reindeer herder in Siberia means spending your entire winter outside, in the cold, with your herd. It means constant vigilance against predators and against the herd wandering off or getting lost. It means riding your reindeer for hours a day in minus 60-degree temperatures. It means sleeping in shelters that are barely heated. It means enduring cold that would kill most modern people without protective gear. And yet, reindeer herders did this. They still do this in some parts of Siberia because they had the knowledge and the equipment and the cultural framework to do it. Because it was possible if you did it right. And because there were few alternatives. One of the fascinating aspects of indigenous Siberian life is the use of horse. The Yakuts domesticated horses specifically for the cold. These weren't the horses you'd see elsewhere. They were smaller, with thicker coats, adapted to cold. They could survive on grass and lichen that they could dig out of the snow. They could handle the cold better than European horses, and they became essential to Yakut culture. Actually, let's pause for a moment and think about something interesting. The Yakuts and other Siberian peoples developed horse and reindeer herding in one of the coldest places on Earth. This meant they couldn't rely on agriculture. It's too cold to grow crops reliably. So they had to base their economy on animal herding. And this influenced everything about their culture, their religion, their social structures, their food, their clothing. Everything was adapted to support a herding lifestyle in extreme cold. This is actually relevant to our story about survival in Siberian cold, because it shows that humans can not just survive, but can build entire civilizations in these conditions. The Yakuts didn't just eke out a subsistence. They built sophisticated societies. They developed art and music. They had complex social hierarchies. They had religious beliefs and practices. They fought wars. They traded. They created. And much of this was possible because of their accumulated knowledge about how to live in extreme cold. Let's talk about some of the specific survival techniques that Siberian indigenous peoples used. One technique was the use of a specific type of lichen called reindeer moss. Despite the name, it's not actually a moss, and reindeer don't exclusively eat it, but they do eat it, and it's nutritious. The Yakuts and other herders learned that reindeer could scratch through the snow and access this lichen. So in winter, the reindeer could feed themselves as long as they were in areas where lichen was present. This meant the herders didn't have to carry as much feed for their animals. The animals could feed themselves, which meant the herders could move with the herd to find the lichen, rather than staying in one place and having to feed the animals stored hay. Another technique was the development of specific types of sleds. Siberian sleds are different from sleds elsewhere. They're designed to be pulled by horses or reindeer in extreme cold, and they're made from materials that won't become brittle in the cold. Wood can become brittle and break when it's very cold. So Siberian sleds were designed with this in mind. They use materials that remain flexible in extreme cold. They're built in ways that distribute weight evenly and minimize drag on snow. Another technique was the development of specific types of clothing materials. The Yakuts used furs, as I mentioned, but they also used plant fibers and processed them in specific ways. Birch bark was used for various purposes. Specific plants were processed to create materials that were warm but not too heavy. Another technique was calendar knowledge. The Yakuts and other peoples developed detailed understandings of the seasonal cycle. They knew when to move to specific locations based on when certain food sources would be available. They knew how long winter would last and planned accordingly. They understood the pattern of the year and organized their lives around it. Another technique was food preservation. As I mentioned earlier, Siberian peoples developed sophisticated methods of preserving food for winter. They made fermented foods that preserved vegetables and other foods. They dried meat and fish. They made dairy products that could be stored. They understood, without modern refrigeration or canning, how to preserve food so it wouldn't rot and would maintain nutritional value through the long winter. Another technique was fire management. Fire was crucial for survival in Siberia. It provided heat. It provided a way to cook food. It provided light. Siberian peoples developed sophisticated methods of maintaining fires. They understood how to build fires that would burn with minimal fuel, providing maximum heat. They understood how to manage smoke so it wouldn't poison you inside a small shelter. They understood how to light fires even in extreme cold, when matches didn't exist, and starting a fire required flint and tinder. And another technique was social structure. This is perhaps the most underrated aspect of survival in extreme cold. Being alone in Siberia in winter would kill you very quickly, but living with others, cooperating, sharing resources, maintaining community, this makes survival possible. Siberian peoples developed social structures that ensured that vulnerable members of society, children, the elderly, the sick, were cared for by the community. If your husband died, the community would help you. If you got sick, the community would care for you. This wasn't just about being nice. It was about survival. Everyone knew that they might need the help of the community someday. The point of all this is that survival in extreme Siberian cold is possible. It's difficult. It requires knowledge, preparation, and equipment. But it's possible. And it's been being done for thousands of years. When we contrast this with the stories of explorers dying or prisoners in the gulags barely surviving, we see that the difference isn't just about toughness or willpower. It's about knowledge. It's about being embedded in a culture that knows how to survive in that specific environment. It's about having access to technologies and techniques that have been refined over centuries. The indigenous peoples of Siberia survived in extreme cold because they had adapted over generations. They had the knowledge, they had the equipment, they had the cultural framework, and they had community. The Soviet machine in the permafrost, engineering impossible now. Let's jump ahead to the middle of the 20th century. The Soviet Union had a problem. Siberia was huge. Siberia had resources. Siberia was part of the Soviet Union, but nobody wanted to go there. It was cold. It was remote. It was miserable. The Soviet solution was typically Soviet in its boldness and its disregard for human suffering. They decided to industrialize Siberia. They decided to build cities there. They decided to extract resources. And they decided to do all of this in an environment where the temperature dropped to -60, -70 degrees in winter, and where the ground was permanently frozen, permafrost. Permafrost is one of the interesting and terrible aspects of Siberian cold. Much of Siberia sits on permafrost, ground that remains frozen year-round. Only the top few feet or meters thaw in summer. Below that, the ground is frozen solid, has been frozen for thousands of years, and will probably remain frozen indefinitely. Building on permafrost is difficult. The ground isn't stable. It's not like building on regular soil. If you build something heavy on permafrost and then apply heat to it, the permafrost directly underneath thaws and becomes unstable. Your building sinks. It cracks. It becomes uninhabitable. This is a genuine engineering problem, and the Soviet Union had to figure it out if they wanted to industrialize Siberia. And, being the Soviet Union, they didn't approach it with subtlety. They approached it with typical Soviet brutality. One solution was to pile massive amounts of insulation underneath buildings, creating a buffer between the heat of the building and the permafrost. Another solution was to use pilings, driving long poles deep into the permafrost, below the layer that would thaw, and building on top of those pilings. Another solution was to not insulate buildings quite so much, letting the heat escape, keeping the permafrost frozen. This had the downside of making buildings cold and miserable to live in, but it meant the building wouldn't sink into the ground. The Soviet Union built cities in Siberia, places like Magadan in the Far East, places like Saka in the northeast, places like Surgut and Norilsk in the central regions. These weren't small towns. These were intended to be real cities with tens of thousands of residents, with industrial capacity, with the whole apparatus of Soviet urban life. Let's talk about one of these cities in particular, Norilsk. Norilsk was built starting in the 1930s as a center for mining and extracting nickel and other rare minerals. It was built in one of the coldest inhabited regions of Siberia. The average winter temperature is around -35 Celsius. It regularly gets much colder. Norilsk sits on permafrost. Norilsk has very little vegetation. Norilsk is about as miserable a place as you can imagine to build a city. But the Soviet Union built it anyway. They sent prisoners, yes, Gulag prisoners, to build it. They mined nickel there. They extracted other minerals. They built factories and processing plants. And by the 1950s, Norilsk had a population of tens of thousands of people. How do you get tens of thousands of people to live in Norilsk? Well, some were prisoners who didn't have a choice, but many were free workers who were incentivized by Soviet policy. If you worked in Norilsk, you got higher pay. You got certain privileges. The Soviet government needed workers, and it created a system of incentives to attract them. But living in Norilsk in winter was brutal. cold was extreme. The darkness was nearly complete during winter. The sun barely rises above the horizon. The industrial pollution created a constant haze of smoke and chemicals in the air. The permafrost meant that buildings were always in some state of structural distress. People got depressed. People got sick. People died. And yet people stayed. Some because they had no choice. Some because they had become accustomed to it. Some because the money was good and they wanted to improve their lives. One of the challenges of building and maintaining a city in extreme Siberian cold is the expansion and contraction of materials. Metals, plastics, concrete, all of these change volume with temperature. In Siberian cold, this change can be extreme. Steel contracts, concrete cracks, pipes burst. Anything that's built has to account for these changes. The Soviets weren't great at this. Soviet engineering in Siberia was often sloppy. Buildings weren't properly maintained. Pipes burst every winter and had to be repaired. Infrastructure was constantly failing. But the Soviet Union kept building, kept pushing Siberian development, kept trying to industrialize one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Let's talk about the everyday challenges of living in Siberian cities like Norilsk. First, there's the issue of transportation. In normal cities, you can walk around. In Norilsk in winter, you can't. The cold is too extreme, so there have to be indoor walkways, covered passages between buildings, underground tunnels. Norilsk developed an intricate system of underground passages and enclosed walkways so that people could get from place to place without spending extended time outside in the cold. Second, there's the issue of plumbing and water. Water freezes. Pipes burst. The Soviets had to develop systems where pipes were insulated, heated, and protected. And even so, pipes burst. Water had to be kept circulating constantly to prevent freezing. If water stopped moving through a pipe, it would freeze within minutes. Third, there's the issue of vehicles. Regular cars don't work well in extreme cold. The engine becomes sluggish. The oil thickens. The battery has less power. Tires become brittle. The Soviets had to develop special vehicles for Siberia. Vehicles with engines adapted for the cold. Vehicles with special heaters that ran even when the vehicle wasn't in use to prevent the engine from freezing. Vehicles with tires that didn't become brittle in extreme cold. Fourth, there's the issue of agriculture and food. You can't grow food in Norilsk, so all food had to be imported or grown in greenhouses. This made food expensive and limited the variety available. People ate a lot of preserved foods, dried foods, canned goods. The quality of the diet suffered. Fifth, there's the psychological impact. As I mentioned, winter in Siberia lasts for months. The darkness is almost complete. This affects people's mental health. Depression rates are high. Alcoholism is common. Suicide rates are elevated. The Soviet Union had to deal with this by building recreational facilities, ensuring that people had things to do inside during the long winter months. And yet, despite all these challenges, the Soviet Union built cities in Siberia. They industrialized Siberia. They extracted enormous amounts of resources from Siberia. They did it by brute force, by by spending enormous amounts of money, by accepting that people would die, that buildings would fail, that the infrastructure would be constantly in disrepair. It was a very Soviet approach to a problem, and it largely worked in the sense that the mining happened, the resources were extracted, the cities existed, but it worked at an enormous human cost. Let's talk about what it was actually like to live in Norilsk during the height of Soviet development. You'd live in a Soviet apartment building. Soviet apartment buildings in Siberia were typically built quickly, with minimal attention to quality. The insulation might be inadequate. The heating might be inconsistent. You'd get extremely cold apartments where the walls would frost over in winter and ice would form inside. Or you'd get buildings that were overheated in parts, creating uneven temperatures. You'd go to work, either in the mines or in one of the processing plants. The work would be hard and dangerous. The cold would make everything more difficult. Your hands would hurt. Your feet would hurt. You'd come home exhausted. You'd eat the food available, limited variety, preserved foods, not much fresh fruit or vegetables. You'd spend your evenings indoors because outside was too cold. You'd listen to the radio. You'd read. You'd spend time with family or friends. You'd try to stay sane during the darkness. On days when it wasn't quite as cold, or on weekends, people might go outside. But even then, you couldn't stay outside for long. The cold was too extreme. You'd go for a brief walk, get some fresh air, and then come back inside. This was life in Norilsk. Day after day, winter after winter. For many people, it was temporary. They'd work there for a few years, make money, and then go back to somewhere warmer. But for some people, it became home. And this, in many ways, is a different kind of survival story than the others we've talked about. It's not about explorers getting trapped. It's not about prisoners being forced to work in the cold. It's about ordinary people making a decision to live in an extraordinarily hostile environment because they thought it was worth it, because they wanted to improve their lives, because they had adapted psychologically to something that most humans would find unbearable. Modern Siberia, the endurance continues now. Let's jump to the present day. Siberia is still there. It's still cold. It's still challenging. But things have changed somewhat. Technology has improved. Infrastructure has improved. Understanding of the cold and how to deal with it has improved. But people are still living in Siberia. Oymyakon still exists. Norilsk still exists. There are about 30 million people living in Siberia as a whole. Most of them are in the slightly less cold southern regions, but thousands live in the extremely cold areas. What is life like in modern Oymyakon or other extremely cold Siberian locations? Well, it's better than it was in many ways. People have better clothing. Houses are better insulated. There's better medical care. Cars have better heaters. Communication with the outside world is possible. But the cold is still brutal, and the challenges of living in minus 70-degree temperatures are still very real. Modern Oymyakon is a town of about 500 people. Most of them work in the diamond mines that operate in the region. Some work in government positions or in service industries that support the town. Many of them have lived there their whole lives. They're Yakuts, or descendants of Russians who moved there decades ago. Daily life in modern Oymyakon goes something like this. You wake up in your house. It's warm because you have a heating system, probably powered by electricity or by a coal or wood stove. You get dressed in cold weather clothing, not casual clothing, but specialized gear. You go outside, but not for long. You might walk to work, but the walk is short and you're covered from head to toe. You work. If you're a miner, you work in an underground mine where it's actually slightly warmer than outside because of the geothermal heat of the earth. If you work in an office, you work in a heated building. If you work outdoors, you're out in the cold, but you're equipped with specialized gear and you take regular breaks to warm up. You eat during the day. The food is better than it was in Soviet times, but it's still limited in variety. Fresh food is rare. Preserved foods are common. You eat a lot of meat and fat because your body needs the calories to stay warm. You come home. You spend the evening indoors. You might watch television, use the internet, read, spend time with family. There's more entertainment available now than there was in Soviet times because of the internet and television. You go to bed. You sleep in a heated bedroom. This cycle repeats. And in winter, it repeats in conditions of extreme cold and darkness. Is it a pleasant life? No. Most people in Oymyakon don't stay there permanently if they have the option. They work there for a few years, make good money, and then move somewhere warmer. But some people do stay. Some people become adapted to it. Some people develop a sort of relationship with the cold and the darkness. Some people even say they like it, or at least say they've grown accustomed to it. One interesting modern phenomenon in Siberia is the growth of adventure tourism. People come to Oymyakon from all over the world, specifically because it's cold. They want to experience extreme cold. They want to take photos in the cold. They want to say they've been to the coldest inhabited place on Earth. They stay for a few days or a few weeks, experience the cold, and then go back to somewhere warm. It's a very different relationship with cold than the people who live there year-round have. Another modern development is climate change. Siberia is warming faster than most places on Earth. This creates new challenges. The permafrost is thawing. Buildings that were built assuming the permafrost would stay frozen are starting to collapse or tilt as the permafrost underneath them becomes unstable. Infrastructure is becoming damaged. The stability of life in Siberia is becoming questioned. There's also the question of the future. As climate change continues, will people continue to live in the extremely cold areas of Siberia? Will they move somewhere warmer? Or will Siberia become more habitable as it warms? And will more people move there? These are open questions. But for now, thousands of people still live in Siberia's extreme cold. They've adapted. They've developed technologies and techniques to survive. They've built lives, however difficult, in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The physiology of extreme cold, what actually happens to your body. Let's pause for a moment and actually talk about what extreme cold does to the human body. Because all this talk about survival and adaptation is interesting, but it's important to understand the actual physiological mechanisms of how cold kills you. When you're exposed to extreme cold, several things happen. First, your body enters survival mode. Your brain detects that your core temperature is dropping. Your body tries to generate heat. It does this by shivering. Shivering is muscle contractions that generate heat. Your body also constricts blood vessels in your skin, trying to minimize heat loss from the surface. This makes you pale. It makes your extremities cold and potentially numb. This is all normal and necessary. Shivering can actually keep you alive for a while in moderately cold conditions. If you can keep shivering, your body is still generating heat. But in extreme cold, shivering isn't enough. The rate at which you're losing heat exceeds the rate at which your body can generate heat through shivering. So your body does something counterintuitive. After extended shivering in cold, your muscles stop shivering. Your body essentially gives up on generating heat through this method. You feel less cold, but actually, you're getting colder. Your core temperature continues to drop. This is called the paradoxical undressing phase. People in the late stages of hypothermia often remove their clothing, which makes them even colder. It's because the neurons responsible for sensing temperature are misfiring, making you feel hot when you're actually freezing. As your core temperature drops, your heart rate slows, your metabolism slows, your brain function slows, you become confused, you become apathetic, you lose the will to help yourself. This is why hypothermia can be dangerous, even in moderately cold conditions. People don't realize they're dying until it's too late. If your core temperature drops below about 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, your heart becomes extremely vulnerable to fibrillation. Even small jostling or sudden movements can cause your heart to go into chaotic rhythms. You can die from this. Below that temperature, your organs start shutting down. Your brain function becomes severely impaired. You lose consciousness. And below about 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, you're essentially dead, though you can technically still be revived in some cases because the extreme cold has slowed your metabolism so much that your body needs very little oxygen. This is the process of hypothermia. It's a gradual process, and it's what kills people in extreme cold. Not frostbite, not freezing. Hypothermia, the drop in core body temperature. Now let's talk about frostbite, which is a different but related condition. Frostbite happens when the tissues in your extremities freeze. Ice crystals form in the cells. The cells are damaged. The tissue dies. It starts with the extremities, your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears, because these are the parts of your body that are furthest from your core and are the first to lose heat. Frostbite has stages. First degree frostbite is superficial. Your skin looks pale or red. It's painful, but the tissue recovers. Second degree frostbite goes deeper. You get blistering, tissue death. It's painful, and some tissue is lost. Third and fourth degree frostbite is deep. Entire fingers or toes are lost. The tissue is completely dead. In Siberian cold, at -70 degrees, you can get third or fourth degree frostbite in minutes on exposed skin. This is why face, ears, and hands must be completely covered. The interesting thing about frostbite is that you often don't feel it happening in extreme cold. Your extremities go numb. The numbness is actually a good sign that frostbite is developing. It means you don't feel the pain because the nerve endings are freezing. So you can have serious frostbite without realizing it until after you come inside and you start to thaw. Then it hurts. A lot. The treatment for frostbite has improved over time. Modern medicine can sometimes save fingers or toes that would have been lost in previous eras. But the prevention is still the best approach. Don't get frostbite in the first place. Cover your skin. Keep moving. Don't stay in extreme cold longer than necessary. Another condition related to cold exposure is immersion foot or trench foot. This happens when your feet are cold and wet for extended periods. The combination of cold and moisture causes tissue damage. It's different from frostbite in that the tissue isn't actually frozen. Instead, the cold and moisture cause other damage, swelling, numbness, skin damage. It's particularly problematic because it can happen at temperatures above freezing, and it's not always immediately obvious that you're suffering from it until after you warm up and the damage becomes apparent. In gulags, immersion foot was a common problem. Prisoners would work in cold, wet conditions. Their feet would get wet and stay wet. They'd develop immersion foot, and they'd be unable to work effectively, which meant they'd get less food, which meant they'd die faster. It was a self-reinforcing problem. Another condition that's relevant to cold survival is cold-induced asthma or bronchial constriction. When you inhale extremely cold air, the cold can irritate your airways, causing them to constrict. This makes breathing difficult. Your lungs are working harder to move air through constricted passages. In extreme cold, this can be a significant problem, particularly for people with asthma or other respiratory conditions. There's also carbon monoxide poisoning, which is relevant if you're living in a heating situation that's not well ventilated. If you're burning wood or coal in a poorly ventilated space, carbon monoxide can accumulate and poison you. This has been a common problem in situations where people are trying to stay warm in spaces without proper ventilation. And there's also the issue of vitamin D deficiency. If you live somewhere with no sun for months, you don't get vitamin D from sunlight. Your body needs vitamin D for bone health, immune function, and mental health. Severe vitamin D deficiency can lead to rickets in children or osteomalacia in adults. It also contributes to depression. People in Siberia deal with this by eating foods that contain vitamin D, fatty fish, organ meats, egg yolks, and by using vitamin D supplements if available. The psychological impacts of extreme cold are also significant. Depression is common. Seasonal affective disorder, sad depression triggered by the reduced sunlight in winter, is particularly common in places like Siberia, where winter darkness is nearly complete. Some people deal with this better than others. Some people develop severe depression during the winter months. There's also the stress of living in an environment that's always trying to kill you. That might sound dramatic, but it's true. In extreme cold, you're always conscious of the danger. You're always thinking about whether your heating is working, whether your pipes will burst, whether you'll be able to get to work safely, whether you have enough fuel to make it through the winter. This chronic stress can lead to health problems, higher blood pressure, increased heart disease risk, weakened immune system, increased susceptibility to infection. And there's also the issue of accidents and injuries. In extreme cold, accidents happen more frequently because movement is difficult. Visibility is often poor, and your hands are so well insulated in gloves or mittens that fine motor control is difficult. A person might slip on ice and break their leg. An accident that would be a minor nuisance in a normal climate becomes a serious problem in Siberia because medical care might be far away and because infection risk is higher in cold conditions. All of this is to say that surviving in extreme Siberian cold is not just a matter of willpower or toughness. It's a matter of understanding the specific physiological threats and how to protect yourself against them. It's a matter of having the right equipment, the right shelter, the right food, and the right knowledge. The fact that humans can survive in minus 70-degree cold is genuinely remarkable, but it requires all the elements we've discussed. Take away any of them, and you're in serious danger. The accidents when things go wrong in the cold. Now let's talk about what happens when things go wrong in Siberian cold. Because no matter how prepared you are, things can go wrong. A vehicle breaks down. You get lost. Have an accident. And in extreme cold, these things that might be minor problems in a normal climate become life-threatening emergencies. Let me tell you a story that's relatively recent and well documented. In 2012, there was a businessman named Alexander Chipizhenko who was traveling by car in Russia, driving from Moscow towards Siberia. He had a relatively modern car. He had some supplies. He wasn't in the extreme cold of Oymyakon or Kolyma, but he was heading towards Siberia. The weather was getting cold. The temperature was dropping. At some point, his car broke down. I don't remember the exact cause, mechanical failure of some kind. But the important thing is that his car stopped working in the middle of nowhere, in cold weather, far from any town or help. Chipizhenko had limited supplies. He had some food and water, but not much. He had a mobile phone, but he was in an area with poor or no signal. He had to decide whether to stay with his car, which is the standard advice for being stranded in a car, or walk toward civilization. He decided to walk. He walked for days in the cold. He was underestimating how far it was to the nearest town. He was exhausted. He was hungry. He was getting hypothermia. At some point, he realized he wasn't going to make it. So he dug a shelter in the snow and tried to survive. A search and rescue team eventually found him. He was alive, barely. He had frostbite on his hands and feet. He had severe hypothermia. He was delirious. He was taken to a hospital and eventually recovered, though he lost some fingers and toes to frostbite. This story illustrates several important points. First, even in moderately cold conditions, breaking down in the wrong place can be life-threatening. Second, having a mobile phone doesn't necessarily help if you don't have signal. Third, making the wrong decision about whether to stay with your vehicle or walk can kill you. Let me tell you another story. In 1995, there was a plane crash in Siberia. The plane was a Tupolev 154, a Soviet-era passenger aircraft flying from Vladivostok to Magadan. The plane crashed into a mountainous area in extremely cold, remote terrain. The survivors, there were several, had to endure the extreme cold while waiting for rescue. The plane was in a remote location. Search and rescue operations took time to organize. The survivors had minimal supplies. They had the plane fuselage for shelter, which was helpful. They had body heat from each other, but the conditions were brutal. Some survivors died. Some survived until rescue teams found them. The survivors who made it became part of the larger story of survival in Siberian crash sites. What's interesting about air crashes in Siberia is that they reveal something important. Surviving the crash is just the beginning. The real challenge is surviving until rescue. And if you're in remote Siberia, rescue might take days or weeks. This is why air crashes in remote areas are often more fatal than crashes in populated areas. Not because the crash itself is worse, but because the time between the crash and rescue is longer. And in Siberian cold, a long wait can be fatal. Let me tell you another story. In 2009, there was a man named Tyamin who got lost while hunting in Siberia. He was from the area, but he got disoriented in bad weather. He ended up separated from his hunting party. The weather got worse. Temperature dropped. Visibility dropped. Tyamin was experienced. He knew how to survive in cold. He made a shelter. He had some supplies, but he was lost. Search and rescue teams didn't know where to look. For days, Tyamin waited in his shelter, in the cold, hoping for rescue. Meanwhile, his family reported him missing. Search and rescue operations began, but finding a single person in Siberia is extremely difficult. Siberia is huge. People can disappear and never be found. Eventually, Tyamin managed to signal to a rescue helicopter. He was picked up. He had developed frostbite and hypothermia, but he was alive. He had survived by maintaining shelter, managing his resources, and not panicking. These stories illustrate the randomness of survival in Siberian cold. Whether you live or die often depends on factors outside your control. Whether search and rescue finds you, whether you happen to know the right techniques for staying warm, whether you get injured in the accident or get lost, whether you have supplies with you. Some people have all the advantages and still die. Some people have almost nothing and survive. This randomness is one of the most unsettling aspects of cold survival stories. You can do everything right and still die. Or you can make mistakes and still live. Let me tell you one more story, because this one is particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. In 1982, a man named Ernst Schauer and another man, Raymond Krona, were stranded in Siberia when their expedition got into trouble. They had to survive the winter with minimal supplies and minimal shelter. Schauer and Krona's survival story, which was documented later, reveals something interesting about the psychology of cold survival. They developed a strong psychological bond with each other. talked constantly to maintain morale. They shared the small amounts of food and heat they had. They took turns staying awake to keep watch. They created a routine that helped them maintain sanity during the darkness and cold. When rescue finally came, they were physically destroyed, frostbite, hypothermia, malnutrition. But psychologically, they had managed to maintain their will to live. They believed they would be found. They believed they would survive. And this belief, whether rational or not, helped keep them alive. This is one of the most important factors in cold survival that isn't always talked about: the psychological will to survive. You can have shelter and food and clothing, but if you give up psychologically, you die. You lose your will to stay warm. You stop making efforts to maintain your shelter. You stop eating. You lie down and accept death. Conversely, people have survived in terrible conditions by refusing to give up, by maintaining a belief that they would be rescued, by maintaining routines and rituals that keep them sane. The combination of physical preparation and psychological resilience is what keeps people alive in Siberian cold. The lessons, what we've learned from centuries of Siberian cold, all right. So we've traveled through several centuries of people trying to survive in extreme Siberian cold. We've seen explorers dying. We've seen prisoners in gulags enduring impossible conditions. We've seen indigenous peoples adapting over generations. We've seen Soviet industrialization in the permafrost. We've seen modern people living in Oymyakon. And we've seen what happens when things go wrong. So what have we learned? What can we take away from all these stories about human survival in minus 70-degree cold? First, we've learned that survival in extreme cold is possible. It's not easy. It's not comfortable, but it's possible. Humans have figured out how to live in Siberia for thousands of years. We've built cities there. We've mined resources there. We've endured there. Second, we've learned that preparation matters enormously. The difference between the explorers who died and the indigenous peoples who thrived wasn't genetic or based on how tough they were. It was based on preparation, knowledge, equipment, shelter, food. The indigenous peoples had all of these things because they'd had generations to develop them. The explorers often didn't. Third, we've learned that information saves lives. People who knew what Siberian winter would be like, who understood the dangers, who had a plan for dealing with those dangers, these people were more likely to survive. People who underestimated the cold, who didn't have a plan, who made decisions based on false confidence, these people were more likely to die. Fourth, we've learned that community is essential. People who were part of a community, whether it was an indigenous society, a crew of a ship, a family, were more likely to survive than people who were alone. Community provided support, resources, knowledge, and psychological support. Fifth, we've learned that psychology matters. People who maintained hope, who believed they would survive, who maintained mental health during the long winter months, these people were more likely to survive. People who gave up, who despaired, who lost their will to live, these people died. Sixth, we've learned that adaptation takes time. You can't just move to Siberia and immediately be adapted to the cold. Indigenous peoples adapted over generations. Modern residents of Oymyakon either grew up there or have lived there for years. They've adapted their bodies and their minds to the cold. Seventh, we've learned that randomness plays a role. Sometimes you can do everything right and still die. Sometimes you can make mistakes and still live. Survival in Siberian cold is not entirely deterministic. Luck plays a role. Eighth, we've learned that technology helps, but it's not everything. Indigenous peoples without modern technology could survive. Modern people with poor technology often struggle. It's not just about having the best equipment. It's about having the right equipment for the specific situation. Ninth, we've learned that documentation and knowledge transmission are crucial. The reason modern people can survive better in Siberian cold than explorers in the 1800s isn't that modern people are tougher. It's that we've documented what works and what doesn't. We've learned from past experience. And 10th, we've learned that understanding your environment is crucial. People who understood how permafrost works, how extreme cold affects materials, how your body responds to cold, these people made better decisions and were more likely to survive. These are the lessons that emerge from centuries of human struggle in Siberian cold. And they're lessons that apply not just to survival in extreme cold, but to survival in any hostile environment. The future Siberia in the age of climate change. And now we get to the weird part. Because while we've been talking about how humans have survived in Siberian cold for thousands of years, and how we've learned to live and work in extreme cold, the cold itself is changing. Climate change is warming the Arctic faster than anywhere else on Earth. This is called polar amplification. The warming is amplified at the poles. Siberia is warming at more than twice the rate of the global average. In places like Oymyakon, which used to regularly reach minus 70 degrees, temperatures might now reach minus 65 degrees or minus 60 degrees. That might not sound like much, but it's significant. This warming is creating new problems. Permafrost is thawing. In places where building was based on the assumption that the ground would remain frozen forever, the ground is now becoming unstable. Buildings are sinking. Roads are buckling. Infrastructure that was built in Soviet times is becoming damaged or unusable. Forests are expanding northward into areas that used to be tundra. This changes the entire ecosystem. It changes what animals live there. It changes what plants grow there. It changes what humans can do there. The thawing permafrost is also releasing methane and carbon dioxide that have been frozen in the ground for thousands of years. This contributes to climate change, which causes more warming, which causes more thawing, a feedback loop. Siberian rivers are changing. Some are running at different levels. Some are freezing later or thawing earlier. This affects the ecosystems and the peoples who depend on these rivers. Animal populations are changing. Some species are expanding their ranges northward. Some species are declining. The reindeer herds that indigenous peoples have herded for centuries are being affected by changing vegetation patterns. But here's the interesting thing. The warming might actually make Siberia more inhabitable in some ways. More vegetation means more potential for agriculture. Less extreme cold means fewer heating costs. More accessible terrain means more potential for resource extraction. Some people think that climate change will actually make Siberia more valuable and more desirable. That more people might move there. That it might become less of a frozen hellscape and more of an inhabited region. But the transition period is difficult, and there are huge uncertainties. We don't know exactly how fast Siberia will warm. We don't know what the climate will be like in 50 or 100 years. We don't know what the ecological impacts will be. There's also the geopolitical aspect. As Siberia becomes potentially more valuable, as climate change potentially makes it more accessible and resource-rich, becomes more valuable, countries will compete for control and access to Siberian resources. So the future of Siberia is uncertain, but it's likely to be very different from the past. The stories of survival in extreme Siberian cold that we've been discussing, these stories might become historical curiosities. Oymyakon might become much more habitable. Siberia might become a region of the world that's being actively colonized rather than marginalized. But right now, as I'm recording this, Siberia is still cold, still harsh, still a place where survival is not guaranteed. And the stories of how humans have learned to survive there are still relevant and still important. Epilogue: the human will to survive, so here we are, at the end of this long journey through Siberian cold and human survival. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about temperatures that are so cold they seem almost unreal. We've talked about people who died in the cold and people who survived. We've talked about how humans have adapted over generations to live in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And through all of this, there's a through line, a theme that runs through every story we've discussed. And that theme is the incredible resilience of human beings. We are a species that is fundamentally suited to temperate climates. We evolved in Africa. Our bodies are designed to function optimally around room temperature, maybe a bit warmer. We lose heat easily. We're vulnerable to cold. And yet we figured out how to live in Siberia. We've built civilizations there. We've survived winters that would kill most animals on Earth. We've endured darkness and cold and hunger and suffering that would break most creatures. That's remarkable. It's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate that. We are not the strongest animals. We're not the fastest. We don't have the thickest fur. We don't have specialized adaptations to extreme cold. And yet we figured it out anyway. Through knowledge, through cooperation, through technology, through willpower, through sheer human stubbornness. The stories we've told tonight, the stories of explorers dying in the cold, of prisoners in gulags barely surviving, of indigenous peoples thriving for thousands of years, of Soviet workers building cities on permafrost, of modern residents of Oymyakon enduring minus 70 degrees. These are all stories of human resilience. And they matter. They matter because they show us what we're capable of. They show us that humans can endure things that seem impossible, that we can adapt, that we can survive. In our modern lives, most of us never face a challenge like surviving Siberian winter. We're comfortable. We have heat. We have food. We have shelter. We have technology that protects us from the elements. But knowing these stories of people who have survived extreme cold, people who have endured the hardest conditions that nature can throw at them, knowing these stories reminds us of our own capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for survival. It's easy to think of yourself as fragile, as dependent on comfort and convenience. But if humans can survive in -70-degree cold, in permafrost, in darkness and hunger and danger, then we're not as fragile as we think. We're capable of a lot more than we realize. The next time you're facing a challenge, a difficult situation, something that seems insurmountable, remember the people of Oymyakon. Remember the reindeer herders who survived for generations in Siberian cold. Remember the prisoners in the gulags who endured impossible conditions and sometimes lived. Remember the explorers who pushed into unknown territory despite the dangers. Remember that humans are capable of surviving, adapting, and thriving in conditions that seem impossible. And with that thought, I think it's time to let you rest. We've covered a lot of cold ground tonight. You've been with me through Siberia, through history, through the darkest winters that humans have endured. So settle deeper into your blanket. Close your eyes if you're ready. Let the thought of human resilience carry you into sleep. Thanks for being here. We'll be back soon with another story of human survival, human strangeness, human struggle. Until then, sleep well.